Welcome to the Fantasy Source Football Podcast. My name is David A. Arnott, sitting here with Bill Bender, and we're looking ahead to Week 5. A quarter of the season is done. Well, now that it's 17 weeks. I'm not going to be a stickler about that. 16 games. Most of the teams are a quarter of the way through the season. The big news this week, player movement. Marshawn Lynch gets traded. Randy Moss gets traded. Bill, how do you see the Randy Moss thing playing out for all the concerned players?
Well, you talk about you get 17 games out of him for starters,
Yes.
because it looks like Randy Moss is going to play Monday night against the Jets. And, you look at his numbers with the Vikings. He never had less than 1,233 yards when he was with Minnesota. He caught 90 touchdowns with the Vikings.
I mean, he's a must-start.
Yeah, you got to start him. And he gives Brett Favre what Brett Favre has wanted dating back to his days at Green Bay. These two have always wanted to play together. It's an interesting experiment, and certainly on paper, when you look at it, you got arguably the best quarterback of all time, arguably the first or second best receiver of all time, depending on your feelings on Jerry Rice, and arguably the best running back in the game right now with Adrian Peterson. So that's a scary offense. They do have a brutal schedule the next 4 weeks: Jets, Cowboys, Packers, and Patriots. So if they lose a couple games here, it'll be interesting to see how Moss, Favre, the whole dynamic with Childress, is that going to implode? But as a fantasy owner, you got to play these guys, and it looks good on paper, and they should be able to score some points.
I mean, Moss is still, in my mind, definitely a must-play. But I actually downgrade him a little bit because Brett Favre, wherever his standing is historically, he's not the same as he was in 1997 anymore, let alone last year when he had perhaps his career year. I'm starting to think more and more that last year was the fluke and not the year with the Jets and not the several years before with the Packers, when I believe he had something like 3 of 4 years were along the lines of 21 touchdowns, 19 interceptions. I'm starting to think more and more that they had a real chance without Randy Moss, without Vincent Jackson, of ending up 1-6, 2-5, and then they would have been looking at Favre saying, well, forget the rest of the season. I don't need to take this anymore. I don't care how ignominious it is. He finally got to play with Moss, as you pointed out. So I think that suddenly jump that he's going to finish out the season. I'm not so sure that he is even a top half quarterback at this point anymore. I know that's kind of bold, but the man is coming off of pretty serious surgery. I just feel like that if as much upside as there is with Moss and Favre, there's also a considerable downside there.
Well, I think the big difference with Moss and what he has with Favre, and this will be the number one factor in whether or not his fantasy value does go up or down, is can Favre get him the ball deep down the field. Tom Brady can do that. Tom Brady is one of the best downfield passers in the game. Brett Favre, I don't know how good. I mean, he's got the arm, but can he get the ball to Moss downfield? Because that is going to be the key. Will teams be able to cheat over the top and take away Moss? It'll be hard with Peterson in the running game, but I still think Brett Favre, he'll project out as like in that 12 to 15 quarterback, borderline starter, more of a backup, and you use him in the bye weeks in favorable matchups. But like you said, I'm going to emphasize it again, that this 4-game stretch against teams that Moss has it in for. You remember, he likes to stick it to the Cowboys because they passed on him. He's been a thorn in Green Bay's side for years, and of course he's going to play the Patriots at the end of this stretch.
Yeah.
So
I mean, a motivated Randy Moss is the quarterback's best friend.
right, and he's still, in my mind, next to Jerry Rice, the best receiver ever to play the game. So I think you keep him in his lineup. Like you said, I'd downgrade him a little bit, but he's still a wide receiver 1, and there's no excuses now for either one of those players.
Moving from legends to a guy that I think I used the word contempt earlier when we were talking about this. I just don't understand why Ken Whisenhunt, coach of the Arizona Cardinals, is going to an undrafted rookie free agent quarterback as his starter, and that's Matt Hall. Now, I understand that Hall had a pretty good career at BYU, but I guess the difference is, and you've told me that you think that there's some upside here. I guess the difference is that I think that the NFL scouting establishment industry, as it were, couldn't possibly have missed on a guy this badly. I mean, is there something, like, what do you see in Hall that kind of gives you hope for him to become, like even a decent NFL quarterback at some point?
Well, I'm not an NFL scout by any means, but there are things I like about Max Hall, and it goes back to his college days at BYU. Now, I'm not going to call him the next Steve Young or Jim McMahon, but there's a long line of BYU quarterbacks, good and bad, that have played in the league, and you pointed out John Beck earlier this morning when we were talking about this. But here's what I like about Max Hall. He had 90 touchdowns and 40 interceptions at BYU. He was 32-7 as a starter. So that right there, I don't care where you play at his college, he's a winner.
Yeah, it's a real track record.
Yeah, that, and he's not playing for a Texas or an Oklahoma. He's a winner at a BYU, which isn't, a power school, let's be honest. But the Cardinals, the thing is, he's in a losing situation because of some things. I mean, it's nice to throw to Fitzgerald, but the Cardinals have allowed 15 sacks. The Cardinals are miserable on defense right now, and he's going to be asked to do more than he's capable of doing in these games. And that'll be, that could be the difference. But as far as an undrafted free agent quarterback, Matt Latufsky, one of my colleagues, and I talk about it every year, Keith Null started in games last year. Caleb Haney might have been a starter if Jay Cutler can't go this week. You see it every year. I remember Spurgeon Wynn starting for the Browns. So
but Hall has the chance to start more than 10 games this year, which, I did some skimming research, and basically the closest I could come to an undrafted rookie doing something like that at quarterback was Andre Ware in 1989, a 6th-round pick getting 8 starts. That was the closest I could come to somebody getting that many starts. Or not Andre Ware, Rodney Peete. I'm sorry. Andre Ware is the guy who came in later. It was the high draft pick that Pete kept beating out. But Rodney Peete, if that's the upside for Hall, let's move to what really matters to fantasy managers. Nobody's going to be picking up Hall this year. I think it would kind of be fool's gold to fool's errand to try to pick him up, hoping he's going to do something as your backup quarterback when there are 30 other quarterbacks out there that are available. It's more that he's going to be affecting the rest of the offense. So, all the way down from Steve Breston when he comes back, Larry Fitzgerald owners, all the way down to even guys like Tim Hightower and Beanie Wells owners. I can't think that this has anything good for anyone involved in the Cardinals.
Well, I'm going to disagree, and from the standpoint, not this week against the Saints. He's in trouble because they're going to fall behind against New Orleans. But if you look at their schedule after that, he's got Seattle twice, which you never know. He's got Tampa in there, and then he's got a hard game against Minnesota after their bye week, which is following the Saints game. But anyway, so there's a stretch there where that if you're in a bye week pinch and you need an emergency quarterback, Max Hall would be a guy worth throwing in there. And let's be honest, this week there are people that are tempted to start Sean Hill against the Rams or Sam Bradford against the Lions, something we would have never dreamed about in week 1. So I think it's unfair to write off Max Hall, but you're right. It's not going to be Kurt Warner throwing to Larry Fitzgerald or Breston, and that's not going to open up the running lanes for Beanie and Hightower. But I'm going to say it one more time, just give Max Hall a chance. Let's see what happens. I'm not saying Pro Bowl tomorrow. I'm not saying Steve Young or anything like that. But fantasy owners might want to just give him a look this week, see what happens.
Okay, let's wrap up with your note of social media entertainment for the week that kind of illustrates how our world has changed and how close we really are to athletes. Yet, even though that we still have that massive distance between us, we have gotten closer to them. What is the story?
Well, there's a couple things that I wanted to share from the the Twitter feed over the weekend. Number one, when Arian Foster wasn't playing in the first quarter, if you did an Arian Foster slug search on Twitter, you would see, why isn't he in the lineup? So many people panicking about their fantasy lineup. They didn't care why Arian Foster was on the sideline. They cared that he wasn't in their lineup. But fortunately, he got in there and got what he needed to get done for owners. But Mike Sims Walker's another case, who apparently has said on Twitter this week that he's angry, that the fantasy owners think that he's terrible because he's not getting the ball.
And I'm fascinated by that he's angry that fantasy owners have been contacting him and telling him that he sucks.
Right. And look at Mike Sims Walker as a player. He's been a boomer bust player this year. He has 2 blanks, but then he has a 100-yard game. People have had way unfair expectations for him since last year when he had a couple touchdowns early in the season, you remember, and all of a sudden he was a fantasy hero. But the bottom line is Mike Sims Walker, even though he plays with the guy Maurice Jones, who obviously is in tune with fantasy football, all of this is irrelevant. Mike Sims Walker is a boomer bust wide receiver 3 play anyway that you're going to throw in on the bye weeks. He's in a terrible offensive situation in Jacksonville. And, he's going to continue to be a frustrating fantasy player. But I just thought it was interesting that a guy like him knows what owners are looking for, which I remind people, remember, it is your fantasy football team, but you still want to root for the team themselves and the players. So don't take it personally when a guy has a bad game because this is football.
Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, David.